Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to another episode of Dispatches. I'm your host, Brady Kreitzer. Our guest today is author and Journal of the American Revolution contributor, Eugene Procknow, and he'll be discussing a little-known British officer with an amazing backstory and questionable loyalties. Gene, welcome back.
Oh, thank you, Brady. Glad to be here.
Gene, you're a great friend of the show. I think everybody in the revolutionary world probably knows your name. You probably don't need to remind us of who you are, but for those first-timers, tell us about your background.
Oh, okay. Well, I've had revolution in my blood. I mean, even as a young boy, I got excited about reading about the American Revolution. In fact, I was kind of reminiscing with some people today about the first book I read on the Revolution was North Callahan's biography of Daniel Morgan. You know, and as a young boy, who wouldn't be captivated by old Wagoneer, Daniel Morgan? So that kind of got me into it. And as an adult, I kept up reading about the revolution as a hobby, but what really changed my life was I had an opportunity to change careers about 10 years ago, and I went back to school, got a degree in history, and so I became much more technically proficient, and that just allowed me to become a writer, an author, and write articles, and it's been a lot of fun doing history full time.
Excellent. So, Gene, you've written about a lot of different people in the revolution. This subject, it's one of my favorite articles you've ever written. It's about a person with very big opinions. He seems to have friends in high places, but he's not a household name. How did you first come upon this character? What made you want to write this article?
Well, it was really kind of serendipity. I was in the University of Michigan Clements Library in their archives. And I guess as an historian, who doesn't have fun in archives? But that's kind of why we do our craft, to be able to do that. But so I was going through some documents in Lord George Germain's papers. And I was doing this for another project I was working on, and I saw this article. And first thing that caught my attention was that the author of the article's name was Apollos. And I thought, well, that's an interesting name. So about that. And then when I read about it, he introduced himself as a retired British major. And I'm thinking, what's a British major doing writing to the Lord Germain, who's one of the top people in the government? And so what kind of temerity would it take for that to happen? And so I got into this article. It's about a 12-page article. It's beautifully written in terms of the prose, not the handwriting. The handwriting is not very good, but the prose is very beautifully done. And then I said, well, geez, this guy really must be pretty smart. Must have had a lot of education. And so how did that happen? And so that's what got me captivated in it. So it took me a little while to uncover this story here. It took me several more archives to do it, but it was really just kind of by going through and looking at something that looked interesting. That's how I got into this into the subject.
Excellent. So, Gene, we mentioned he's a retired officer. His name's Apollos Morris. He's Irish, if I remember correctly.
Yes.
He's very revealing as an individual that could maybe help us understand this wider Irish landowning group as a whole. But tell us who he is. Give us his backstory.
Well, rebellion is in his blood. His great-grandfather was William Morris, which was one of the Oliver Cromwell's lead officers when Cromwell invaded and conquered Ireland during the English Republic, and as a result, Cromwell gave Morris an estate, a 1,350-acre estate and a castle. And so the Morris family became what's called generosus, or noble family in Ireland. And so they were held in high regard locally, and that estate ended up getting passed down to Apollos. But like his great-grandfather, Apollos decided to get into the military. He started at the bottom level, though. He started as an ensign in 1757 and worked his way up to major by the time that he resigned. He ended up fighting in several battles in the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War in Europe, but he fought in the Caribbean as well as in North America. He got to know the St. Lawrence Valley, the Hudson Valley, and he got to know a lot about what he thought a lot about the Americans, and so that's why he felt he had the expertise to tell Germain how to deal with the Americans and the emerging American rebellion.
Gene, I was really struck reading this article. You begin with this assessment that Morris offers of the revolution before it really even begins. And he pretty much nails a lot of it as far as
Yes.
how it's shaping up, how it's probably going to end up. Talk about how he saw the war, because I was sort of dumbstruck by it.
Yeah, and that's one of the other reasons what caught me in attention in this article. He was kind of right on. He was much more premonition than the king and parliament and other leaders in Britain about the situation. He in the letter that he wrote, which was at the end of December 1775. So it was after Bunker Hill, after Lexington and Concord, but it was before the British had sent the vast armada to New York to invade New York. So it was in that intervening point of time. Morris basically told Germain that you got three options, and none of them will get you back to the antebellum situation that would happen at the end of the French Indian War, where there was no taxes in America and these colonists were loyal to or were supportive of the empire. So he said you have three options, and none of them are really great, but one of them is really bad. So he said the best one you have is to try to negotiate some kind of relationship to keep them inside the empire. He said it's too valuable not to do that. The trade is too valuable. You need to, negotiate something to remove the taxation or remove the royal veto and figure out what you can negotiate. That's the best thing to do. The second best thing to do is just to let the colonies go. And his view was that if the colonies weren't ever going to be able to band together, in his view. And so it would be Virginia and North Carolina. And how would North Carolina, one of the poorest of the colonies, survive on its own? They'd be invaded by British or invaded by the Spanish from the south, that kind of thing. So he didn't think that'd be very attractive to the Americans. But his third solution was the military solution. And he said that was just not going to be very good for the British. He basically said that the only way you can win is if you occupy all of the ports with sufficient forces to hold the ports. At the same time, deploy what he called a grand army that would be able to defeat any rebel force in the field. And then said, oh, by the way, forget about invading from Canada. The 300 miles between Quebec City and New York City is going to be a death trap for your soldiers if you do that. We all know what happened there, and that did become that army was British army was captured there. So he basically said there was no military solution, and which is really premonition, because there ended up being no military solution, no matter how many soldiers the British could send to America. And he ended the story, which is really interesting, is with the story of a Samnite general fighting the Romans, in classical Roman history, and the Samnite general's name was Gallius Pontius, and he captured a Roman army and had them surrounded, and he had a choice of what to do, and the doctrine back then was to kill them all, just slaughter them all. That was the way they fought back then. His father said, no, don't do that. Let them go, because then you'll make a friend, and they can be on your side, and they won't come back and get revenge. And he decided the middle ground. He decided to make them to be slaves. And sure enough, the Romans rebelled, came back, and they ended up defeating and slaughtering the Samnites. And so it was this idea that even if you could win a military victory, it would be transitory. He saw the rise. And by the way, this guy wasn't really out on a limb. I mean, Apollo Morris wasn't really out on a limb. Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations, if you look at the end of Wealth of Nations, you'll see the same advice in The Wealth of Nations. So this, he wasn't really there were others that felt the same way he did.
Gene, you mentioned you were taken aback that this relatively unknown officer would write to a high-ranking British official at the start of the war. The big turn is he's going to be writing to George Washington after this, completely on the other side. So how does that come about? How does that happen?
Yeah, and there is some murkiness there, and there is some in the historical record that's not quite understanding. We don't really know exactly how Apollo Morris got from Ireland to Philadelphia, and then from Philadelphia to Washington's camp in New Jersey. But Morris claims that he hired a privateer under his own with his own economic resources to come to the United States. That's a possibility, but I mean, who would the privateer be working for? I can't imagine in Britain hiring a privateer to attack the British, right? So it's probably most likely that he took passage to the Caribbean, and then found an American privateer to take him to Philadelphia. So that's probably how he got to Philadelphia. But he got to know Washington because for really some because Washington was in dire needs for an adjutant general, and so he was an adjutant general in the French and Indian War, and so he sought out Washington, and Washington said, "Oh, I need to talk to this guy because maybe he could help us here because he needed that adjutant general." So that's kind of how the relationship started. There was an Irishman on Washington's staff by the name of John Fitzgerald, and they became friends, and I think that connection helped him connect with Washington.
Do we have any writings from George Washington about Morris, explaining what exactly he sees in him, what need he could fill as adjutant general? Did you find anything like that?
Oh, absolutely. And Washington was quite enamored at first with Morris. He said he was courageous. He was a very capable officer. I'm sure Morris regaled him with his exploits during the French and Indian War, and so Washington was quite enamored with him at the beginning, which is pretty amazing for Washington because he's not usually that effusive in praise for people. He's a little more reserved typically, but there was a section where Morris said, "Well, maybe I'm just going to go back to Philadelphia because I'm really interested in finding a way to get peace between America and Britain." And Washington found out he was going to head back to Philadelphia, so he talked to his aide, and John Fitzgerald said, "Go find Morris, bring him back here to my camp. I want to have dinner with him." So he had a private dinner with Washington. That's pretty amazing, but it turned out Morris really wasn't interested in joining the Continental Army. He was more interested in figuring out how do we create peace between Britain and the United States, and there has to be a way that two good peoples. Two good factions of the same people could come together with a solution. That was his idea. And I think the reason behind that will become clearer in the future. A lot of American historians say he just was a gadfly. And later on in the story, I think we'll find out that maybe he wasn't so much of a gadfly, but he had a broader, higher purpose for trying to find peace between the two warring parties in America.
I think we can maybe start to work toward that now. He's going to, as you say in the title of the article, have this fluctuation of loyalty that becomes kind of a theme in his life. What happens next?
Yeah, I mean, he told Washington at one time if Howe turns down my peace offer, I will join your army. And so he was kind of leading Washington on. And this went on for about 4 months. So it was a lot of back and forth for 4 months, and Washington showed amazing patience for that. He actually even assigned a temporary adjutant general versus a permanent adjutant general. So there's some thought he could have kept that open for Morris. But Morris ended up trying to send letters to Sir William Howe through loyalists, and Howe was really having none of it. Howe realized at this point in time there's nothing to negotiate. The only thing the Americans wanted was independence. The only thing the British didn't want to give them was independence. So there was really no negotiation possible that's going to take place. And so at the end of the day, Washington got very upset with Morris and felt like he was kind of betrayed by Morris. He led on, by Morris. And so that part did not end well.
Yeah, what does Morris ultimately decide? He is going to fall on one side in this war. Talk about that if you could.
Yeah, he basically tells Washington, I cannot fight for either side because I have supporters and I support both sides. I'm going to be neutral. And with this, Washington says, game over, this is enough. That's just not going to work. There's no neutrals. He said there's no neutrals in America at this point in time. It's very dangerous to be neutral in America. And so Washington sent a letter to the Continental Congress and said, this guy is dangerous to us. Be careful of him. Don't let him go back to New York because he's got valuable intelligence. Apollo Morris was a talented officer. He gathered a lot of intelligence, and that may come in a little bit later. But he was a very keen observer and knew what was really going on here in the Continental Army. So Washington was really concerned that this guy was really kind of a spy and would end up going back to New York and tell how bad shape the Continental Army was in. And so he was very concerned about that. So once the Continental Congress got Washington's message, they sent Benedict Arnold, believe it or not, who arrested him. And if you look at the arrest warrant for Morris, it's signed B. Arnold, and in beautiful handwriting. So it's a kind of a one page, something that Morris kept in his files. Because the warrant was given to him, right? So it was kept in. So that's actually was in some archives in England or in Ireland. But it's a gorgeous document. So Morris was placed under house arrest in Philadelphia, while Congress decided what to do. And what happened is they asked him to sign as a gentleman, which people did back then, a parole document, and the parole document said. It's like a non-disclosure agreement today. You won't tell anything what happened here. You're not going to give away any of our secrets. You're going to go back to Europe. You're never going to come back here. And so they end up releasing him on parole. He rides by horseback down to a port in Delaware and gets on a ship to go to France. And so he had to go to France first because that you couldn't ship him right to. There's no shipping between the United States and Britain, at least for patriots. So he got on another sailing ship and head back. So he basically failed in his quest to find reconciliation between the British and the Americans.
Mm. So how does his story end up, Gene? What can we say to wrap that up?
Well, it's funny. So he gets on this ship. He goes over and he gets a fast voyage. I think it's like 6 weeks. So very fast voyage back there. He gets right outside the harbor in Nantes, and the French pilot comes on the ship. And then all of a sudden on the horizon comes an English privateer from the Isle of Jersey. And that English privateer captures this American ship as a prize and takes him to Jersey. And so you'd think, well, what difference does that make for Apollo Morris? He's a Britisher, right? However, they got very suspicious of him being on an American ship. So what's this former British officer doing on an American ship? So they arrest him. And they turn him over to the British Admiralty, who placed him on the Blenheim, which was one of the largest warships of the time, a 90-gun warship in the harbor at Portsmouth. And so he spent several months incarcerated on that ship. And he wrote his friends to try to get his friends to vouch for him, and friends wouldn't do it because I didn't know what he did in America. I mean, how would you know what he did in America? So finally, he comes clean and describes all of his American activities, and the Admiralty let him go, and so he was eventually freed and sent back to Ireland. But he did not live the simple life of a country gentleman afterwards. That revolutionary thing was still in his blood. During the American Revolution stirred up a lot of feelings in Ireland, and there was a burgeoning Irish rebellion going on. And so Apollo Morris, on his estate, his large estate, got his tenants organized as an extra legal militia to intimidate the British. And he, with a lot of other people, did that. And the British actually did change the policies and gave more power to the Irish Parliament in the early 1780s. So it actually was somewhat successful at that point in time. And then Apollo Morris ended up being a tutor and a military trainer for an Irishman by the name of Arthur Connor. And he's not as well known in the United States, but in Ireland he's very well known, and he was an early Irish revolutionary during the Napoleonic era. And Apollo Morris regaled the young Connor with stories of his exploits in America. Of course, they were a little bit embellished, and they were embellished like he was like a secret major general, and he had done all these things which he didn't do. And unfortunately, some of those stories have gotten into the American historiography, which aren't really true. But by going to we understand the genesis of them because we see them in the Irish historical record there. The Connor family had a tremendous collection of papers that did this. And then he ended up, Morris ended up dying at the early age of 54, and from unknown causes. But like most revolutionaries, he died with big debts. Because I think he was more of a revolutionary than really a business person, and so his heirs lost that 1,350-acre estate. So it was not very profitable. So he and Thomas Jefferson have a lot in common in that regard.
So, Gene, there's a lot of ways you can answer this. It could be a commentary on retired British officer life. It could be a commentary on the Irish. What would you say is the big takeaway from this article that helps us understand the Revolutionary era better?
I think what I came away with is if you look at the story from an American point of view, you get one view. You get a view of a gadfly. You get a view of an officer that was doing a quixotic mission that was never going to succeed, and a guy that really wasn't all that bright necessarily, right? That wasn't very aware, wasn't politically aware, wasn't militarily aware, and so you come away with that point of view. But when you look at it from an Irish perspective, you see something different. You find out this guy went to Trinity College. This guy was a college-trained guy. And by the way, Lord Germain went to the same college a few years after him. So he understood Irishmen too. So if you look at it from that perspective, the broader perspective, you see that this guy's true loyalties really were Irish independence. And he was looking for ways, how do you be an equal in the British Empire? Yeah, if you don't live in Britain, you don't live in England, how do you be an equal? And that's what he was trying to find. And so I think the broader story is more interesting than looking at it from a narrow slice, an American slice or just an Irish slice. I think that, to me, tells us as historians and as readers of history that we need to broaden our perspectives to make sure we understand what we're reading, interpreting properly. So that to me is the real case study. This is why this is really important.
Well said. Well, Gene, as always, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you, Brady. I really appreciate you having me on, and been a lot of fun speaking with you.